streaming. Okay, let's see what's up on YouTube. It's going through. It's going through. Let me know if I'm choppy or anything on your end, like connection wise.
So far, so good. Yeah.
Okay.
So,
It has
the
the stream on. There we go.
Okay.
Okay,
So now I want to. This is a very weird situation.
All right, here we go. What's up, everybody? This is a special edition of Comrades Corner. You know, Project Nerd HQ here. I have my friend Nick from across the seas, from across the pond, from the land down under, joining us today. And, you know, we will be definitely making a lot of more contact as we enter this journey together. So I'm going to let Nick just give like a quick introduction of himself, his background, where he's from, like the work that he's in. So, Nick, if you want to take the floor, this is all yours, brother.
Where to start? I am an educator, I guess, as my day job, but it's very much a part of the gig economy. And I work at one of the mainstream universities in my area. I teach sociology and criminology. I wrote a master's thesis in 2015 looking at the value of conspiracy theories in contemporary culture. That was pre-Trump. And probably because of that, I missed a lot in that thesis. But there's parts of it that I think still hold up pretty well. And I'm currently working on a PhD looking at sort of youth strategies for housing security in the post-global financial crisis era, and the ways in which young people envisage the future with the kind of underlying premise that what worked for your parents won't necessarily work for you. And a lot of that is to do with political economy, socio-political forces that operate on all of us, but are perhaps easier to see in young people who, you know, from their... There's a thesis by someone named Jeffrey Arnett that talks about emergent adulthood. And once you sort of get past 18 years old, the school bells stop ringing, so to speak, as a metaphor. And then you sort of lose all of that formal structure in your life that doesn't really return until you have a mortgage and you know, you're married and you have children and things of that nature. So there's a period where you're kind of just lost in the stream of capitalism, however it's taken, or communism, if we're talking like, you know, if I was doing this thesis in Russia in 1970 or something like that, it would be the political economy of communism. Likewise, if I was doing it in China today or in Vietnam today. So it's all very contingent upon certain factors, but being you know, a part of the culture that I'm a part of, and living in the region that I live in, it's those contingencies have the particular flavor of capitalism in the 21st century.
Salute to you for just everything that you just said, and the fact of being an educator. Like I tip my hat off to you. I have some friends, a lot of friends of mine that are actually in that same field. So it's one, the importance of acknowledging how important education is in a system. You know, with everything that you just said was spot on money. But with the movie that just came out with like Fred Hampton, and highlighting that the main focus that he wanted to make sure people understand was education. You know, we could have the same structures that we have, and you and I, Nick, we could be for like a left-leaning society, or just like a socialism world like we discussed before. But if we use the tools that like a fascist use, or if we use the same tools that like capitalists use to make sure that the wealth and inequality of where it is or how it got here, if we still use those same tools, we're no better than them, you know.
Well, yes and no, because there's action and then there's intent, and the intent behind the action is important.
Yeah.
But sometimes when you look back on history, and I'm yet to see the Fred Hampton film. I'm not sure when it will be available in Australia or if it is already available. I'm sure with the power of the internet, there are ways and means, right?
No, definitely. I'll give you my VPN.
But in regard to when you look back on something historically, sometimes the intent gets lost. And it can be, there's a lot of political spin on things. And so you can end up in a situation where what we call the whitewashing of history, where certain events that, like Martin Luther King or W.E.B. Du Bois or Malcolm X, all these heroic figures that, I mean, I studied Martin Luther King in high school. I did one of my major projects for, I think it was like social geography or something, was on Martin Luther King, and I read his biography and things like that. But even that didn't give me the understanding that, hearing it from the lips of Michael Brooks, for example, would give you. And so, obviously, rest in peace, Michael Brooks. We miss you dearly every day. But his intent and action in the world, Michael Brooks specifically now I'm talking about, his intent and action were aligned in this very particular way that cut through a lot of that noise. And he had a talent at that not many people have. But at the same time, there are tools that can be used in ways that open up the opportunity for redirection and reimagination. And so I'm not necessarily sure that you can just say the fascists are using these tools so we can't use them. QED. I don't think that's right. I do think that you have to be aware of response to how you approach something. So if you take the case of someone who I'm sure you're very familiar with, Andrew Cuomo, the New York governor, he did this massive bait and switch because in one sense he was super important in, say, May, June, July last year, 2020. He was doing daily press conferences with a lot of information that was vital and necessary to disseminate to the public, and against the backdrop of the Trump administration and their approach to the pandemic, which was a herd immunity approach. That is what they went for, and I would be speculating to say that had Scott Morrison had more political capital in this country, that Australia may have also gone that direction. But unfortunately for Scott Morrison, and very much fortunately for us, he lost a lot of political capital during the bushfires that preceded the pandemic, overlapped with the pandemic by like a week or a month at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, depending on when you sort of start the timeline, because you could start it in March or February or all the way back in, the start of December, end of November 2019, if you're looking at it from an epidemiological point of view. And so Cuomo comes out and is speaking the truth in May, June, July, with these daily press conferences and talking about the ways in which the R naught number needs to be reduced and these things. And, he wasn't necessarily the most brilliant communicator in that moment, but he was kind of a lone figure in that moment, especially when you had like the whole, I don't know if you remember this, but the Liberate Michigan movement that was going on at the same time, and all these distractions that were happening. So to have somebody in a position of political power explain the risk and danger that was happening in regard to a very frightening and destabilizing pandemic that affected everybody was comforting. And even in my own way, on the other side of the world, listening to a couple of those early press conferences by Cuomo, desperate to understand this virus from as many different points of view as possible, I was comforted by Cuomo. So I can understand that sort of whole emergence of the Cuomo sexual, if you will. However, now we're a year past that, with less than a year with change or whatever, but we're well past that point, and Cuomo's got this book out saying I am such a hero, I did everything perfectly. And meanwhile, when you actually look at the real world sociology of what happened, and look, New York is not unique in this. This isn't a New York problem. This happened in Victoria, in Australia as well. This happened in other parts of I think New Zealand maybe is the only country that was really outside of this bubble, so to speak, but they've got a very small population comparative to like New York, for example. So it's very difficult when you've got an airborne virus that is highly transmissible, and impacts elderly people at a much faster rate than younger people, to protect nursing homes. And that's a reality, regardless of whether Cuomo's the governor, or de Blasio's the mayor, or if Rudy Giuliani had come back and was mayor, or whoever you want, right?
Yeah. Yeah, because as critical as I am of Trump on his handling of the pandemic, I'm just as critical on Cuomo. I'm just as critical on Nancy Pelosi, on everyone that's in power. Because you could blame Trump, just like Trump, wanted to blame like the origins of the virus or where the virus came, and use that as like a fear baiting and fear mongering tactic to like diverge any responsibility from him onto the next person. But the same way how he lacked in his part, Andrew Cuomo didn't set anything up when it came to like the airports, when it came to like, I understand like airports are like controlled federally and it's federal jurisdictions, but at the same time you still have state guidelines that you could put in place for people traveling into New York State and New York City, coming into the airport, setting up like a testing and tracing policy, trying to start something instead of just blaming Trump, because Trump just blamed someone else. It's just a circle jerk of just blaming instead of someone taking responsibility.
Yeah, and that was kind of like the specific issue with Cuomo. Look, I guess for me the point is that it's really difficult to look at social movement from a sort of bird's eye view. Like if you imagine you're in a helicopter looking down on all of New York at once, and you're looking at all the movement. What is the population of New York? Is it 10 million?
I'll tell you right now. I believe it's a little north of 10 million.
And then there's a certain concentration of that within the island of Manhattan. Right?
Yeah, it's 18 to 19 million. Yeah, 18 to 19 million.
And Manhattan's what? 10 million of that is in Manhattan or something.
And then like the outer boroughs are spread upon.
Right. So you're dealing with a lot of vectors at that point. Like it's a very complex problem. And to protect people in nursing homes becomes very difficult. And I don't think there's an easy solution. And I'm not giving Cuomo an out here. What I'm saying is, regardless of who the governor of New York was, in the way that this was handled internationally, with such variance from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. You look at Italy, you look at Spain and how they reacted, or you look at Japan, or you look at Brazil, right, and how they reacted, or Australia and America and how we have reacted. There's no consistency between the countries in terms of these are guidelines of best practice that, if followed, will produce a reduced rate of infection among a population, and it can be scaled. So if you're New Zealand and you've got 5 million people, or you're New York and you've got 19 million people, the strategy can work. That never happened. That never emerged. But the issue with Cuomo is that he lied about it.
Yeah.
Right. He wasn't he wanted to come across as this honest politician who is just spitting facts in a time of crisis, and everyone rallies around the flag. And he got all the political, social, and to some extent economic capital out of that, to use a Bordeauxian term. But then on the other side of it, when the truth now is starting to be unraveled and is emerging, it shows that he was just as willing to pass as anybody else, and not actually take responsibility. So in that regard, I think that we're facing a difficult period. I mean, you look at difficult period. Instagram, which is where you and I spend probably too much of our time. And you see different posts. Well, I mean, we're sort of building to the Texas situation. So you see all these posts that have the through line of 2020 into 2021. As bleak as this is going to sound, is we are on our own. Right, yeah. They are not going to look after us. Globally, labor, working people, lost something like $3.7 trillion in wealth, whilst at the same time, the 1%, as David Graeber coined it, made $3.6 trillion. Right, so. Those numbers are suspiciously similar, right?
It's upsetting once you take a step back and then you realize it. It's basically like, all right, cool, we got robbed for everything while they gain everything plus more.
Yeah, and I think I heard someone say yesterday that capitalism could be considered a form of genuine artificial general intelligence, in the sense that it has the ability, independently of sort of human intervention, to defend itself against even the most strident critique and attempts to dismantle it. So it is really incumbent upon us as political speakers in this context. And look, I mean, I don't know what this platform is going to grow into. I don't know what my impact is going to be. I know that your the work that you've done so far, that I have been fortunate enough to be in a front row seat to watch, has been of a great standard, and I'm sure an audience will form over time, and you'll have a thriving platform in the near future. But I don't know what your analytics are today, and that's kind of irrelevant in a broader sense. But the point is, it is more incumbent upon us now, as we come into a post-pandemic world, than it was in a pre-pandemic world. Definitely. To continue the mission of Michael Brooks, in the sense of building an internationally minded cosmopolitan socialism.
And you said it perfectly, and I appreciate you on, I see myself just as a lowly Instagrammer or a lowly YouTuber, but I appreciate, the remarks that you just said, and your engagement on the platform. Like you didn't have to engage with me whatsoever, and you was just totally open, willing to interact, willing to like help me learn other stuff while trying to do what I was doing myself and Alex. And with Alex in school, right now, and he's going to try to be on the weekends. Is I want this to grow to a place that is like yourself or other people as well. If not this, this coming around, but the next coming around, I want to set it up to be like an open panel. If people in the chat, if anybody wants to step on down, more than welcome, just to have a conversation, because sometimes conversations need to be had. Sometimes other people make it hard to have them, and but like Michael Brooks always said, and the common factor of what connected us when we had our conversations was, he always said to be harsh and critique towards systems and structures, but be empathetic towards people, because someone's shaped opinion, it's their lived life experience, and they could live a totally sheltered life or a totally bubbled life that they don't understand certain aspects, or they don't understand what does bother and what is actually harming us as a society. And if we are going to grow as a collective, we need to acknowledge these, and we need to not be afraid or not be want to get in our emotions when challenged on certain beliefs or certain ideas that we had growing up.
And it moves very quickly, and then moves other deeper levels of the political currents, if you want to think of it as like a river of thought. The surface layer is moving at such a pace that you can't swim against it in any kind of meaningful way. But force that creates that upper level current is a little bit slower and has a much longer history. And I think, I've been reading some Dostoevsky lately, and he was a realist in terms of his art, in what he created in his novels, in the same way that someone like a Dickens or a Tolstoy or a Flaubert were. And that realism gives you this amazing insight into not the specific historical truth of any society, but almost like a higher fictionalized truth of society at a given point. And so Dostoevsky is writing in a period of time when the beginnings of capitalism were coming to Russia, as it was sort of moving away from a feudal society into a capitalist society. And there'll be a lot more to say on that in the future. But what I think is interesting is at least from my perspective, and look, I could be projecting, I could be wrong, someone else could read, the works of Dostoevsky and look at it completely differently. But from my reading of it, there are some uncanny parallels between the world of the 1860s and the world of 2021, in the sense that the force that can really impact and operate on your life in the sense of precarity and the inability to see where your future is going to be in 10 years can really influence and change your decision making on a broader level. And that's where you can be vulnerable to narratives which seem to offer solutions, but in reality oversimplify the world into almost a Manichaean good versus evil story. And I think one of the other things that people may not know, that both you and I have a sort of more than passing fascination with the world of one Alex Emmerich Jones. And I sort of touch base with Mr. Jones every now and then through, and shout out to Dan and Jordan over at Knowledge Fight, who have put together a body of work which is really incredible, and the diligence that they have shown in undercutting and fact checking and demolishing the nonsense of Alex Jones and showing him to be the sort of narcissist that he is. And Look, I'm sure he'll be very cross with me if he ever hears this, because but I'm low on his list of priorities. I think he's got some pretty serious Sandy Hook lawsuits to deal with in the immediate future.
Yeah, and some right now pertaining to the insurrection as well.
Yeah, look, I think it's interesting. I saw a clip on the Majority Report with Sam Cedar that was playing. I think it's Ron DeSantis trying to push this like it was Antifa line of nonsense regarding the 6th of January.
Level it's just ridiculous. From anybody who saw the videos, anybody who saw any coverage, I was watching it live, and it's like if anybody thinks anybody in that crowd was Antifa, you need to have a political compass test done to you. Something done.
I wouldn't rule it out, right? When you're talking about volume, and
sorry, I got the police sirens in the background. NYPD's finest. My apologies.
They're coming for your socialist stars. Any volume of people is going to have a broad diversity, right? If you look at the distribution of political ideal, it will cluster around a particular point of gravity, which would I mean it's obvious. It's Trumpism, right? That's who was there. That's who they were there to see, was Donald Trump. This was quite openly organized by Ali Alexander, Roger Stone, Alex Jones, and then if you do a process of extrapolation from that, I wouldn't be surprised.
Leaderships. You had Nick Fuentes telling people to throw their phone away so the FBI couldn't track them.
Well, I mean, sage advice, right? Because what was the? I think it was like a week later. Because Parler went down, but whatever's put onto the internet stays on the internet. That's the thing. It's kind of the opposite of what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. In this world of post-privacy, but in specific regard to the 6th of January. Could there have been individuals who attended Black Lives Matter protests in the preceding summer and were vocally against fascism? Sure, of course. Why not? There were a lot of people there. However, was that the organizing body that created the chaos? Was this really a sort of false flag operation? No, it wasn't. In reality, what it was is, to put it bluntly, it was a group, a convergence of militia groups, whether they're, I won't name names because I don't want to be on their radars, but we know who was there, riding in on the back of a wave of delusional people who had their lives interrupted in a pretty substantial way by narratives around QAnon. And that's what it was. And so when the pictures are taken, you see, you don't see the insidious, violent, and dangerous people. What you see is a group of people who look, out of place, and who look like they don't really have a plan, who don't really have any kind of what's the next step, or any kind of self-initiating objectives. Now, that's undercut by the fact that, on the 6th of January specifically, there was a gallows and a noose erected and chance of hanging Mike Pence going around. So there was some element of we know what we're doing here, and the impeachment trial in the Senate further enhanced that narrative with some of the footage they showed that had previously not been made publicly available. So all of that together. Ron DeSantis is a fool, but he is a fool in the sense of, knowing that he's gonna be okay. that this narrative will have salience with his constituents.
Oh, definitely. Any Republican that is holding office, or any candidate that, any Republican that was running for an office seat but didn't win, and, they lost by a little bit. Them just standing behind this narrative, even if they know deep down, they know it's BS. They know the election wasn't stolen. They know there's no cabal of Democrats that are stealing babies and drinking blood, but it gives them support. It feeds a narrative for the base that you just pointed out, and it's a culty, scary thing to think about, because if you look at like conservatives in America, or Republicans in America, majority of people that have that are those labels, they hold positions of power where it comes to like law enforcement, or where it comes to like academia. Some of them are principals. Some of them are like small business owners. A lot of them work in like trade unions when it comes to carpentry and electrician. And it's scary to know that someone who's a cop could be persuaded by a Facebook meme into believing this, or somebody who's a small business owner in middle America could be persuaded by this. You had people taking private jets and like making this out to be a field trip, and then one lady gets arrested, and the judge granted her permission to leave the US to go to Mexico for vacation. Like, the double standard. And then you have Republicans in power that just preach whataboutisms and try to make videos of Democrats saying we're going to fight the system as like, oh no, we're going to fight Trump. Like, come on, it's not the same.
Well, let me just have a quick look for something here.
Because when I engage with people, when I put like my war helmet on Twitter to engage with people, all they say is like, buildings burning and this, that, and the third, without like trying to actually have a conversation of like, what's the surface issue, what's the root problem,
Right, and that's important to understand, and that is. So there's a couple of things that we can kind of bring a convergence around here. One is with Texas, which is, the nominated topic that you wanted to discuss, and we're miles from that when we're talking about January 6th and Alex Jones. But the reason that we're there is because I think when you want to sort of have the indicators of what the different narratives are. So if you want to, what is the liberal political thought of contemporary US politics? You could go to someone like Scott Dworkin, right? And what is Scott Dworkin going to say? He's going to say Biden is doing a fantastic job. Everything Biden does is great, and it's such a relief to be in this position. You could go to some of the really hard left creators on different platforms like TikTok, who are kind of saying, this is why I didn't vote in the election. Your harm minimization strategy clearly hasn't worked, because that was based on $2,000 checks, the end of the concentration camps on the border, and yeah, exactly, and a genuine opposition to the consolidation of corporate power, none of which has actually happened. Like student debt cancellation, for example. Like during the election, the number was $50,000.
Yeah.
Immediately after the election, I'll see if I can maybe do $10,000 on a kind of staggered basis. Maybe we'll see. I don't know if I have the votes. When both houses of the Congress, led by voices like Jamal Bowman, are shouting, we said $50,000. Why can't we do $50,000? And it's the same with the $2,000 checks. It's like. When I do mathematics, and I admit, as someone who works in the humanities, I am not a mathematician, and I struggled with calculus in high school. But when I do math, $2,000 hasn't ever equaled $1,400.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't know what the drift is there, but it does harm. The senators from Georgia who, very explicitly ran and in fact, successfully returned the Senate to the Democratic Party on the flagship marquee campaign promise of $2,000 checks,
Next
and
week they said they out the door next week.
Yeah, I mean, look, from my perspective, we have a very different economy in Australia. We have a much more egalitarian basis for our society. We are still, under the crown, so to speak, where the ultimate head of state for us is Queen Elizabeth, and that, is pretty much meaningless, but has had serious political consequences in, the past with the sacking of Gough Whitlam, for example. So it's a different culture. There's much more, multiculturalism happening. There's there's a huge Greek community. There's a huge Irish community. There's a huge Vietnamese community. There's a growing Sudanese community. There's a growing Afghani community, and yes, if you go back to the Cronulla riots of Australia Day in whenever it was 2006 or 2005 or whenever it was, and when you look at the kind of systemic racism that is happening in this country, there's strong parallels with that. The way that our Indigenous community is being treated, all of that is true. However, there are a few different fundamentals in terms of pillars of the economy. So we have a nationalised healthcare system under Medicare, is what it's called over here, and you get a card. When you're born, you go in your and that entitles you to health care. And then on top of that, you can still engage in private health insurance for more optional stuff like dental, or if you want to get some elective surgery done, something like that. There is a space in our economy for private health insurance, and then built on top of that are these kind of aggregators who will help you to determine how to do price comparisons between insurance offerings. Well, I won't name names, but they exist in countries like the UK as well. These same companies. So it's not quite the same, and it's not as desperate as what it is in the United States. However, we're a lot smaller, so the compounding effect of concentration of wealth and power among, the Murdoch Group or Gina Rinehart, Twiggy Forrest, etc., has a more dramatic impact on the other side of that equation. So it's a little bit different in that way, but again, the narratives are the same. So you want to see like this kind of culture war going on. I remember when the new trilogy of Star Wars began, the sort of post-Lucas era, the Gamergate narrative was alive and well in Australia when that movie was released. Like walking out of the theater and seeing a whole lot of men in their 40s being, having their hopes dashed, that the reality of this franchise that they have embedded much of their identity in for 25, 30 years remains and is primarily a vehicle to sell children toys. And the juxtaposition of that and the confrontation with that was something that causes a cognitive dissonance and a psychic tension that needs to be relieved. And that's where a voice like a Scott Dworkin or a Alex Jones or even a Michael Brooks can come in. Now, I'm not comparing those. I'm not saying that Alex Jones equals Michael Brooks or at all. Of course not.
No, but the voice is what just
the different voices that can come in and fill that void and help elevate you from that situation. And I think where we really draw down to it from a political position in terms of theoretical apparatus is the politics of precarity. right? Where if you have a stable job and you can predict what the next 5 years of your life are going to be like with relative accuracy, then what difference does Alex Jones make? You laugh at it. You're like, oh, the frogs are turning gay. Okay, that's funny. It doesn't really matter. If you have a strong belief in the meritocracy, and Andrew Cuomo comes out and says something, then you're much more likely to take it on face value. And if you live in a stable economy where you have a stable income and you have the myth of the meritocracy at its peak, like say in the 1980s, then whatever Ronald Reagan says seems right. It's only in hindsight that we can really break it down and understand the damage that those narratives were doing then, now.
But you point out a very when speaking on Gamergate, and a very peculiar look at it, because it's grown men, and I can understand. I'm 31 years old. I love comic book. Check. I got Power Rangers up here. Yeah, I indulge myself, but it's grown men who are 30, 40, who fell in love with this genre and this culture and this and just escaping reality. They fell in love with just the mythos and everything that had to do with Star Wars, but coming to the realization that it was just an avenue and a machine to just sell toys to kids, and not wanting to grasp that reality. It's the same thing. You could equate that to politics and not understanding capitalism and the lies that capitalism has told us over the years. Is if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, even though your bootstraps are cut off, or America is the greatest place in the world, we do this, that, and a third. But if they don't want to come into grasp of reality over a franchise like Star Wars, it's kind of hard for them to come into grasping like a reality of like the real world of like what's actually going on, what's actually feeding the wars, what is actually feeding the wealth inequality that we see that's going on. The amount of people that die every year because of capitalism, not having access to clean water, countries that are left in impoverished conditions because big countries like the US or like the EU, they go in there, strip them of their resources just to benefit them, and it's literally just to benefit a small percentage of the population of the main country that's doing the harm.
Well, and I mean, it's not just third world countries. If you want to look into something called the Murray-Darling Basin, and the New South Wales government allowing, big agriculture multinational big agriculture to come into Australia and then sublet sections of their property, their farm property, to, basically Forex traders on Wall Street to turn water into a commodity that they can then, restrict in a sense of the rentier class and release back when it's profitable for them to do so. So this is the thing. It's like, even in a mixed economy, a healthy person can't be called healthy if they have a little bit of cancer, right? And that's what it is. So, you can be otherwise fully healthy, but if you have even, one cancer cell in your body, that could become a huge issue. Mm-hmm. And it could lead to your demise. And for me, looking at this, my issue is we have the red pill, we have the black pill, but what is the blue pill, right? To use that stupid Matrix level metaphor that I grew out of 10 years ago, but realistically, this whole issue of the red pill is a problem. And further to that point, I don't know if you're aware of Robert Evans, who is a podcaster through the iHeartRadio network and does a lot of good work on anti-fascism and was instrumental in documenting the Portland protests over the.
No, what's his name again? Because I have like the iHeartRadio app, and I'm always trying to find like political. It's hard to find like any political stuff on the radio because a lot of it is very right leaning or centrist leaning.
Yeah, so Robert Evans is great. So Robert and then surname Evans.
Got it.
Yeah, and he has a number of shows. He works with like Katie Stoll and Cody Johnson on Worst Year Ever, which was a podcast about the 2020 elections. They started in 2019, and I don't think a show has ever been better named than the Worst Year Ever pod for the 2020 cycle, because I think all of us have that sense of 2020 being a really dreadful kind of. It's a signifier for a set of really, awful things that happened over a course of, 12 and now beyond 12 months. And Robert Evans, I think, was, he had a series. I forget when he recorded, maybe 2017, 2018, called "It Could Happen Here," which was looking at the comparisons between civil war in Syria and the potential for civil war in America, and how certain groups in different regions of the country could strategically monopolize, say public water or public electricity or public gas or whatever, to do real damage to a community that would really things are destabilizing around the world, and in America, and when we talk about America, first of all, what does that mean? Because where does Puerto Rico fit into that? Let alone America, Samoa, let alone Australia as the 57th state of America, or whatever you want to look at like that. And I guess that's a bias towards my own predilections in terms of American politics, rather than looking at my own politics, which are trash. Australian politics are trash in many ways. But on the broader scheme of things, if you look at the United States, the contiguous United States of America, the lower 48, then even that is too big an idea to meaningfully analyze in any serious way. So you have to then break it into smaller chunks to be able to really look at it. And if you look at California, it's got a very distinct culture. Texas has a very distinct culture. New York has a very distinct culture.
Absolutely.
And there are things in common that people who live in all three states would share, that they can say they're American. And the same with people in Hawaii to that extent. But there are very different micro political forces that are at work in those regions. So the housing market becomes a good way to look at that, to understand what is happening at more local levels, and the ways in which that works. And the politics of precarity becomes very important, because in the sense of the 1990s as being this period of time that we now look back on with intoxicating nostalgia.
Yeah.
To think about that decade as being the peak of neoliberal capitalism delivering, right? Especially under the Clinton years. And then there was a sort of law of diminishing returns with the Obama years, and recovering from the global financial crisis, kind of masked in a real way a lot of the different things, underlying dynamics that were never addressed by DC in the wake of the GFC, that came back to bite them in the ass under Trump. And now we'll see, the Band-Aid approach of the Biden administration. Maybe not. I mean, there are elements of international importance that Biden has exceeded expectations on already. So we'll see. I mean, I withdraw any judgment until we have a bigger data set. But the Ian Shapiro in 2019 delivered the Devane Lectures at Yale, a series of, I think, 26 lectures, and it's open to the public. It's available on YouTube, and they're called Power and Politics in Today's World. And he does an extraordinary job of mapping some of these things. And, you know, if you want a book, you could read something like Barry Eichengreen's The Populist Temptation. And then if you want to get really theoretical about it, you could read something like Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. But all of these three different things are pointing in the same direction, that when individuals get to a point of insecurity where things become desperate, their political orientation changes dramatically. And so where people were moderate 15 years ago, that space has been really overwhelmed with a more reactionary politics on both the left and the right. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the right wing are more flamboyant and ostentatious, and therefore they get more of the press. But in both, you know, in both cases, there's a response to a real world problem that is almost invisible. And that's the issue of, you know, the Gilded Age. And that's where Dostoevsky comes back into this as well, in the sense of he was in the Gilded Age, in the ramp up to the Gilded Age. And so, you know, I can see strong parallels between the world that Dostoevsky creates in his novels and the world of today, with the kind of, you know, different moves that people are trying to make on an individual basis to get a more secure foothold in the economy of that time. Now, on top of that, you have the problem of capitalism being able to embrace and consume these anti-capitalist narratives into capitalism and then commodify them to the point where, you know, maybe there isn't a way to get out of capitalism. You know, maybe Mark Fisher is right in his proclamation in Capitalist Realism that capitalism is too entrenched into our vision of the world. But at the same time, maybe you're living in the beginning of 1989 in New York, in the analogy of Moscow in 1989. You know, like at the beginning of the year, 1989, no one saw the end of communism coming, and by the end of the year, the Berlin Wall had fallen. So, you know, what do you make of those kind of things coming together?
Yeah, but it's a, you know, if anyone, you know, someone could just randomly skip through this and like hear your take on different parts of the U.S. banding off and forming their own little parts, like to have like their own little civil war. It's a scary notion and a funny notion to think, but it's a possibility. Just like look at Texas, for example. We brought it up earlier, but Texas itself, like the power grid, is separate from the rest of the country. So if it wanted to go about that route, it absolutely could. It literally has access to like the Mexican border. It literally has access to like river canals, like water shoreways when it comes to like transportation. So it's a funny notion to make, but it's a scary notion at the same time. And, you know, with the look on it, when you talked about being in New York City in 1989 or being in Russia in 1989 with the fall of communism, it's a tipping point, because society as we know it, you know, from the beginning of time to like right now in 2021 as we're speaking, every economic structure that was in place, it always came to its end. Whether it's feudalism, whether it's before that, whether it's, you know, in the 70s when credit cards and the thought of credit came about in order to like keep the capitalism machine going, to like every 7 to 10 years there's like a market crash, or there's some financial crisis that's there, or there's an outbreak right now that's resetting everything. But it's like it's a system we live in that's deep, and it's like it's in the entire world, like you just said. But it's a system also that, you know, it crashes every 7 to 10 years. You know, it's bailouts here. It's, you know, we can't do this because we have debt because of that, this, that, and third. And it's a system that needs to be recognized as a faulty system and has to be changed. If not, it's so much finite source in the world, so much resources in the world that you could just harvest so much. Like we're gonna come to a point there's going to be nothing to harvest. There's going to be nothing that we could take and try to make, you know, try to make capital off of. It's going to come to that point.
I mean, arguably we're already past that point. Like, you know, I mean, someone who I found immensely fascinating at the time. And, you know, it's interesting to look back on their proclamations now and see, you know, where they went wrong and what they got right is Michael Rupert. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with Michael Rupert, but he was a propagator of a peak oil narrative. But he came to fame because he was a police officer in LA during the Iran-Contra period when Highway Ricky Ross was doing his thing. And you know, he was a whistleblower who said the CIA are pushing drugs in America, and sadly, Michael Rupert committed suicide. I think nearly a decade ago now, unfortunately. But he got a lot of things wrong, certainly, because he had a spin on it. He had a preconceptual political, economic, and social container, you know, worldview orientation that leaned in a particular way based on his, you know, being a man of a certain age. We're all men of a certain age, right? And so, you know, just to tie in something before, we were talking about Star Wars and Robert Evans. He has a new series or a new episode on Behind the Bastards with his guest host Jamie Loftus, talking about the manosphere and the quote unquote Sigma male. So that might be an interesting you and people listening to this to look for. But in the broader scope of things, right? I am someone who, you know, was taken in by Hegel and by psychoanalysis and by, you know, the wonderful world of Baudrillard and all of that stuff, and the idea of simulacra, a copy without an original, and the real being being a place where you can't actually get to. And if you were to get to the real, it would be a very cold and unforgiving place. And so we need a certain level of fantasy to be able to just operate on a day-to-day basis. I don't mean fantasy in a very technical term, a very Lacanian notion, right? Or, you know, in a Freudian sense, it's the narrative of the ego dealing with the impulses of the id, which are then, you know, tampered or tempered by the injunctions of the superego, which are always contradictory.
That's
right?
why Moby Dick to me is like a book that is the perfect representation and reflection on the world that we live in and society that we live in. You know, the lust that Captain Ahab had, but like the disregard for his crew. Like the only thing he cared about was getting revenge. But just the thought of just like, I just have these crew members that are just a commodity that I could just use in order to get to my endless goal, which was nothing. He died at the end, but
yeah,
it's like
yeah, but that,
Orson Welles' Citizen Kane, like that movie with, and that was like the first introduction that I had to like any type of media that was more than just cartoons or anything. And like high school watching that as a freshman, but it's you reach a certain amount of fame or fortune or like, you know, or just people being scared of you, but it's like you die alone at the end of it. You know, you have all this money, but you can't take that with you to your grave.
Yeah, what does he say? It's Ruby, not Ruby. What is he?
Rosebud.
It's gonna bother me.
It's Rosebud.
Rosebud.
Yeah, and
it's really Xanadu is what you're really talking about. You know, the empty mansion. You know, where no one, where you lose that kind of human connection. And look, I mean that applies. So it's almost a 1-to-1. With Jeff Bezos, and that's probably because it's based off the Hearst empire, and Bezos is following the Hearst model in that way. Certainly, yeah, of course. But
it's like when you get to that point, like in Citizen Kane, it's like that same mindset of him being alone and like the house, the mansion, whatever, by himself. It's the same parallel in the workplace when you're the boss and you're just the higher up. You don't care about anything else that's underneath you. It comes to a point that, yeah, you may be in your factory or you may be in the boardroom with people, but like, are they like, do you actually consider them people, or do you walk by them and they're basically invisible to you because they're not on the same economic level that you are, or they're not on the same, they don't have the same financial like wherewithal that you have, you know?
Well, you could take that from a number of different perspectives, but I like, but part of my thesis is to understand what is how to critique neoliberalism as a part of the literature review to say this is the environment we're in socially, politically, economically. And so, a part of that is to look at the history of writing around neoliberalism. And in 1999, Chomsky was writing on the Seattle protests against the G20
Mm-hmm.
or the World Economic Forum, which is a really significant historical moment. Was the anti-globalist protests of Seattle. Ironically enough, Alex Jones, just to bring him back into the fold, calls himself an anti-globalist, and yet he does not align with those protesters at
Mm-mm.
all. He's on the
Mm-mm.
opposite side of the spectrum.
And if you watch any
But with
content, I'm sorry, if you watch any content of his that was from that area, it had nothing to do with like anti-globalization. It was more on like the police are using
no,
militarized weapons, just
yeah.
random conspiracy theories he was going on. Had nothing to do with the globalist elite.
Because fundamentally, there's a distortion in Jones's thinking specifically that comes from a Joe McCarthy era, which is heavily invested in John Birch Society narratives of anti-communism. But that aside, Noam Chomsky wrote a book, Profit Over People, which was all about those protests in 1999. And or part of it, and it's like the beginning of the critique of neoliberalism in some ways. Like he uses the term a couple of times in the book. But more importantly is the fact that under any kind of gig economy construction, people cease to be people and they become assets. And you look at the recent move to unionize Amazon in Alabama, and solidarity to those
Mm-hmm.
people in all seriousness, because that is a really important domino that needs to fall in order to make any kind of structural movement.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at why we're in the predicament we're in, with everything that we've spoken about, and also something that we haven't, which is eminently important in any discussion of Texas, which is climate change. It's an existential crisis. Like, we have such a small amount of time to solve it, and every day that we waste counts for 2 days, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you need to make it's like in terms of that 7 year timeline that we have left, what that refers to is if we were to take action today and dramatic, serious, well organized action with global coordination and cooperation from all major nations, and support for all other nations, then in the space of 7 years, we could turn this around, and that would create sustainable futures for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
But that's antithetical to capitalism, and so capitalism is a major stumbling block to achieving that. But unfortunately, every day you waste, you not only lose the day you wasted, but you lose a day on the other side. So if we waste another year, the equation doesn't become, oh, we still have 6 years left because of the exponential nature of it.
Mm-hmm.
If we waste another year not tackling climate change, then we end up with 5 years
Mm-hmm.
left on the timeline, or potentially even four
Four
years
years.
left on the
And if we
timeline
wait more than that, we
because
probably only
of
have 2 years or 1 year.
yeah, and then there's always the possibility of runaway climate change, because it's a second order issue that we have absolutely zero control over,
Mm-hmm.
where essentially the ozone, the atmosphere, the ozone layer that's protecting us, could be ripped apart, and in that case, then who knows what happens?
It's a different ball
It's a
game.
nuclear bomb going off. Yeah, it's a meteorite hitting the Earth. It's all of that at once.
There's
So,
this new movie
and
out on
that's
Netflix that is basically that. It's like leading up to like what could possibly happen. It's Trash Seekers or Space Seekers, something like that. Basically, it's a Korean movie that basically is a dystopian future that is like climate change has destroyed Earth. We've moved society into space, but it's like a labor mispractices that happen on in space when it comes to like trash removal from space and mining for materials. It's a very deep look at what the possibilities could be. But someone like me, I saw that movie, and the first thing that came to my head is like, okay, what are the labor practices going to be in space? What are the labor laws going to be? What's going to be the first thing that's prioritized? Are we going to prioritize capital, or are we going to prioritize labor rights and labor laws? You know?
Yeah, it's an interesting projection to have a conversation in a way that doesn't necessarily implicate all the connotations of having that discussion in a much more practical way. Like, when we hear Bernie Sanders, Chairman Sanders, talking about,
Bernard Sanders.
yeah, talking about the his desire to push through various amendments in the reconciliation bill that has all these connotations that are steeped in a history of red scares and anti-communism and all this and that. Whereas when you project that same narrative into space, where it's like a fresh start, so to speak, a new plane of existence in which to orient everything, then you see it in a new context, allows you to perhaps engage with ideas of communalism, of togetherness, especially when the forces of space are so hostile to life. It is incumbent upon us to work together as a species. I mean, look, you go back enough in time, what is society for, right? You read a book like Hamlet's Mill, or even Thomas Hobbes, and the question of what is a society for, and I kind of reduce it down to two things, which is feed people and stop people from dying. And then everything else on top of that is not in the real, so to speak. It's not tangible. We're not dealing with the real. We're dealing with this superstructure, which is culture. And culture is fluid, and it's responsive to the particulars of the environment at any given time. But the fundamentals of a society are to feed people and to prevent unnecessary death. And here's my thing, right? To bring it all down to what I was talking about before, the red pill and the black pill and all that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we knew from 2008, right? 2007, we knew, right? We already knew that this was unsustainable. This form of capitalism, of hard libertarian, Grover Norquist, no government libertarian ideology that became reinvented through the Tea Party and then through Trump, is not workable. And so the Obama approach to trying to recover the economy rather than trying to overhaul and redesign the economy was a mistake, because we knew then, and look, I mean, we is a very loose term there. Like, who is it? Who is that we? Am I including that we? Are you including?
Mm-hmm.
I can't say, but collectively there was a knowledge that this was not sustainable at the point of the global financial crisis. Just look at Japan, right? Look at Japan's recovery from the Asian flu, not to be confused with Trump's nonsense about SARS-CoV-2 or
Mm-hmm.
COVID-19.
Yeah.
I mean the Wall Street Asian flu, the markets that collapsed around 1997. And you look at the incel movement that rose out of that, in response to that, and the fact that you have all these zombie banks and zombie corporations, and the rise of the precariat. I think that the movie that really covers that well, if you want a pop culture reference, is Parasite, which is a Korean film. But we know that doesn't work. And then one side is saying, well, what if we do fascism, right? What if we give fascism a red hot go? Because then we can just get rid of our enemies and we can create a homogenous society with an authoritarian leader that can be super responsive to any crises we have. But rather than just the human issues involved in that, first and foremost, that's always a bad strategy because, even in Tasmania is perhaps the most successful genocide of human history, definitely of colonialism, definitely of the English brand of divide and conquer, Roman logic reconstituted 43 generations later. But the sense of every genocide has survivors, right? Yeah. So a politics of extermination will never work. And that's just at a fundamental level. But then you get into the ethical and moral issues with it, and it's just completely objectionable, right? It's ridiculous. It's the wrong direction, and it will never work. But unfortunately, for Manichaean thinkers, it's appealing because it offers a way of saying, well, I don't need to talk to my enemy. I don't need to question my own instincts and my own narratives and my own politics. I can just shoot. And that is appealing to a lot of people. Now, the issue is, if you take the 2020 presidential election in the US with Trump versus Biden, there is no pendulum. There's no point for the pendulum to swing back the other way, right? There's no equally charismatic leader on the left who is pushing an openly left-wing agenda. Bernie Sanders came close, but Sanders is a career politician, and Sanders has shaped his argument in however many decades in traditional contemporary politics, rather than even AOC. When the revolution comes, Ilhan Omar, AOC, Jamal Bowman, Cory Bush, etc. are going to be part of the revolution because they are institutional politicians, and that's not a comment against them. I think they're vital, and I think I agree with 90% of what they say. It's more the case of they are part of a system where that entire system needs to go. Now, they may lead that charge in the end, hopefully, but the pressure that climate change is putting on us, especially in Texas, when you have Ted Cruz fleeing to Mexico to be a good dad, while an 11-year-old child freezes to death in the streets, and that's not nice. And that's not nice. So we know what doesn't work, which is neoliberalism. We know what cannot work, which is fascism. But there's no unification around sort of the Michael Brooks project of cosmopolitan socialism or a more traditional Marxist-Leninist approach to communism.
Because I feel like people in the world, especially here in America, they're scared of they're just scared of one, of the other, and two, to be challenged. Like I grew up in a you know somewhat of my background, but I grew up in a family that's an immigrant family. My grandmother's from Puerto Rico, grandfather's being from Trinidad and Tobago. So I was raised in a household with a thought of this is what it is to be a good immigrant. This is what it is to try to fit in and be a good American. I did it for several years. Every job that I had, working in restaurants or working in supermarkets, I always worked my way to the top and became a manager in every job I had. Working in EMS as an EMT, becoming operations supervisor, 911 supervisor. But it came to a point when I was working in EMS that I realized it was for nothing. Because it had no value with it. I was a supervisor and I made my way up the ladder in a private company that was literally for profit. But as a supervisor, I will point out why are we paying EMTs 50 cents above minimum wage? I will point out you want them to be in uniform and clean uniform, but you don't give them uniform allowance. I will point out the trash healthcare and the dental programs, how we don't have MetroCard programs for our workers who are working 50 cents above minimum wage and could have to decide whether they go to get a weekly MetroCard or have money for lunch during the week. So it was there that I voiced a lot of my opinion. the chief at the time, which I have a lot of respect for. He was harsh conservative, harsh Trump supporter. Once they found out that I was a Puerto Rican, once they found out that I was Muslim, once they found out that I was like a leftist progressive and had these views, I got moved to overnight working operations, basically working from 10 o'clock at night to 6, 7 in the morning. But it was around that time that I found Michael Brooks, working overnight. And, they're the reason why I am today. So I thank them for like trying to like throw me under the bus and having me work in the trash schedule that nobody wanted to work. But at the same time, it gave me time that, I could like have 8 hours that I could just listen to Michael Brooks or like Sam Cito or whoever and just open my mind and not be afraid to be challenged. Because over the years, in this, how can I say this, in this exploration of just like trying to have a new shape my viewpoints, I have been challenged on a lot of beliefs that I grew up with, preconceived notion, and just to open your eyes and see that the grass is greener on the other side. Just don't be scared. If you need a hand, you could grab my hand or Nick's hand.
Yeah, my fear is as great as the next person's. I wouldn't describe myself as a coward, but there's certainly I'm intimidated by certain things, and I am timid in certain ways. And when I I think we found each other actually on TikTok. That's what I think. I found you. I did a TikTok video or something, and then I followed you over to Instagram. Because you had some, you'd framed something about socialism in a really interesting way, and I was like, I want to hear more of what this guy has to say. And then you did a live one morning when I was making coffee, and I opened it up, and I was the only person besides you and Alex in the room, so I felt awkward about that. So I said, I'll say something.
No, appreciate it, yeah.
And from that point on, like just saying hello. From that point on, the conversation hasn't stopped.
Yeah.
Right. Really, we've been in constant communication with each other from that point on, and the more that I learn about you, the more I feel that really strong sense of solidarity. And in terms of your example, it's no different than what I'm doing. I mean, it is different in terms of like the actual expertise and specialty, but the dynamics of the workplace are no different. A university and a hospital should be decommodified, and they should be run in the most egalitarian way possible, with a view to expanding how many people can be involved in the franchise, right? If you made every single person in the world who wanted to be an associate professor, if you gave them a serious path to becoming an associate professor that was tangible and real and paid well, what's the harm?
Yeah.
What's the harm? Likewise, if you gave every single person who at 5 or 6 years old said, I want to be a doctor, I want a legitimate pathway to become a doctor, what is the harm to society, right? It's not, but we've got these Wall Street bros who are misanthropic in the way they view the world, and because their environment is so fierce and competitive and a zero-sum game, and because Wall Street plays such a dominant role in shaping not just the American economy or the economies but equally the global economy, where we end up with this downward pressure. And what Piketty, and it's not just Piketty. I mean, look, the 1970s was a really important era. Whether you look at it from a Foucauldian perspective or from Piketty, both of whom are French theorists. There are other theorists who, off the top of my head, I can't remember their names, but I mean, like Graeber is one of them, but also Guy Standing kind of fits into this mold with the Precariat, his book from 2010. And there are some other names I'm missing that discuss it more explicitly in terms of a rentier class and things like that. But you had two major oil shocks in the 1970s, which initiated and created the petrodollar. And to that extent, Nancy McLean's Democracy in Chains, Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine, and Philip Mirakovsky's Never Let a Crisis Go to Waste, all built on those narratives, right? I'm only an amateur librarian, Anthony. If I'm not a proper librarian, so it's hard for me to remember all these names. But all these point to 1973 and 1975, and then 1978 and 79 as being really significant moments at the end of Keynesianism, right? And Keynesianism was this new